All right. Good morning. My name is Adam Wollowick. I am Senior Director of Business Development at Stryker. I focus on mergers and acquisitions, external partnerships for our trauma and extremities business. I've been with Stryker for about 10 years, a little more. I'm also an advisor to Precision Life Science Partners, an advisory firm focused on early stage medtech startups, and a mentor at the Endless Frontier Labs out of NYU Stern in New York. I think it's pretty rare to have the acquiring company, the founder and CEO of the acquired company, and the lead investor all on the stage at the same time to talk about a singular transaction and to give you the diverse perspectives around how the company's growth trajectory and founding began, up through the ultimate investment by a significant venture capital group, and then ultimately an exit to a large strategic. So it's really I think a rare opportunity, and it's incredible to be able to share the stage with these two guys who have now become good friends. And we can't tell you everything about the deal, but we hope to be able to tell you, a good amount and give you some real insights that will be actionable. So I'll let Aaron and Greg introduce themselves. So Aaron?
Yeah, hi. Nice to see you all. Thanks to Adam and the LSI team for letting us do this today. So I've been working in orthopedics and medtech now for 30 years. Started as an engineering co-op in 1994 and just kept on going. Maybe wasn't smart enough to go a different direction. But, most recent company was Artelon, sold to Stryker back in July.
Awesome. Well, first, thanks, Adam and the LSI team for setting this panel up. Looking forward to the discussion. Greg Banker. I'm a partner with Vensana Capital. We're a med device focused venture capital firm. We invest across the product life cycle, everything from development through commercialization, everything in between. And our team's spread out between California, Minnesota, where I'm based, and DC.
Awesome. So before we jump into the details of the deal, maybe I thought we'd start by talking a little bit about the company, its founding. So Aaron, maybe you can spend a couple minutes telling us about sort of the history of Artelon.
Yeah, sure. So back in 2003, I came to an orthopedic company called Wright Medical. I had worked for the management team prior to that. And the board had a thesis for the business to be a market leader in extremities. And that was the job that I was brought in to do. I was leading their extremities business unit. Spent 8 years there. Over the course of that time, grew it from about $5 million in legacy revenue to almost 200 when I left in 2011 to go out into the startup world. When I left the company, I was aware of some changes in the market for foot and ankle products. You were seeing this big explosion of new companies, new products. There were some pretty big unmet market needs around the ankle for soft tissue products. It was outside of the sort of core competencies of the orthopedic companies that played there at the time. There were some sports companies that were making entrances into foot and ankle with soft tissue products, but didn't have the wherewithal to really know the market. So that was my direction in the startup world. Artelon had been a Swedish company that developed the core technology, ran for about 10 years, and sadly went out of business, ran out of cash, closed the doors. Our U.S. investors acquired the assets out of bankruptcy in 2014. I came in as CEO in 2017 and really dedicated the technology towards fixing pathologies in the ankle, particularly with ankle instability. So we took an already developed technology and really repackaged it for that group of user needs and indications, and found commercial success pretty quickly. 2020 was the year we launched the products that were kitted and configured for those physicians' needs, and sort of took off from there, leading ultimately to the exit with Stryker in 2024.
Yeah, so Stryker got involved in 2021. That was the first time we really interacted with Aaron and his team, and I've been following them along. I think the launch of those kits was probably the inflection point. Foot and ankle surgeons want convenience, they want efficiency. I think our discussions really accelerated in 2023 in the summer, actually around the time that I came into my role, moving from our spine business to trauma and extremities. And it continued, pretty much at a reasonable pace through 24 when we executed the deal. From Stryker's perspective, we believe firmly in time over target. as we like to say, right? We spend a lot of times with companies getting to know the management team, seeing their growth trajectory and their market uptake, and that's really important to us. So I think for the founders in the room, when you're interacting with companies like us, I think building those relationships, spending time is really, really important. Sometimes we'll spend more than 5 years with a company, sometimes longer, before we'll actually pull the trigger and do a deal. This one was especially unique because there were 2 Stryker businesses involved, our foot and ankle business, but also our sports medicine business, both which have customers that deal in the soft tissue space. And so that was a unique one here. That I think is an opportunity, but it's also a challenge. Maybe, Aaron, you can comment a little bit on the challenges that you saw from your perspective dealing with 2 groups.
Yeah, I think you characterized it perfectly because most orthopedic companies were sort of constituted that way. They had foot and ankle business units that were focused on more trauma-like products, plates, screws. And then they had sports medicine businesses that were focused on soft tissues, but mostly in the knee and the shoulder. And those groups didn't necessarily have a lot of interaction. That was what created the market opportunity for us to come in and say, hey, we're going to be the world's first, sports ankle company. We had very little direct competition and we could grow a business. When it came time to transact the company, that led to some unique challenges because for the aggregators in this space, they had to try and figure out how to get these different business units within their organization to collaborate. And, all of the orthopedic companies in the market were configured a little bit differently. So, I think at the end of the day, our ability to focus carefully on one market that really mattered was what helped us navigate that. Because when you have a good business and you're growing well and taking share in a really good market, the acquirers will do the things they need to do to figure that out. If you have a really diffuse business that's sort of in different market verticals and it's harder to unpack, it's really a lot tougher to get to the finish line.
For sure. Great points. And I think from my perspective, I'm seeing more and more companies come forward that whether they're calling themselves platform technologies or, they have complex offerings, they're crossing multiple verticals in a large strategic like Stryker. And so it creates challenges when we think about deals, whether it's valuation, gaining alignment, getting it across the finish line. And so I think it is something to watch out for. Certainly there was a great strategic fit here, right, for both of those businesses. Our sports team focused mainly on hips, shoulders, knees, needed to have a stronger presence in foot and ankle. Our foot and ankle business, number one in the marketplace, but didn't have soft tissue offerings. So it made a ton of sense. So you dealt with us for a couple of years. How did that go? What was it like to engage with a big company like Stryker?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I think a recurring theme you'll hear about from us is relationships. Part of my bio that I neglected to mention was that Wright Medical, the company that became the leader in foot and ankle surgery that I worked for, was acquired by Stryker back in, I think, 2020, maybe. So my initial contact with Stryker was actually through my former colleagues in the Wright Medical business, who I was very familiar with. They understood very well what I was trying to do in the market. It started really as just kind of casual interaction. As the discussion picked up momentum, I started to deal more with Adam, more with people in other business units within Stryker. And, when you kind of go all the way to the end of a deal, that eventually turns into big diligence teams with many people across different disciplines within the Stryker organization. So overall, I thought Stryker was very organized for a company of their size, very professional. Workforce is extremely competent. Your subject matter experts really do know their stuff, and it can be challenging and sometimes overwhelming for people in small companies to work across to such a big team in such specific areas.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's important for people to know that Stryker runs a decentralized business development model. We believe in subject matter expertise. And so we have teams in every one of our business units. They take the deals from sourcing, negotiating, all the way up through close and ultimately integration. So when you're looking to deal with Stryker in terms of business development, you've got to work with the BU teams. Trying to go to the top of the enterprise is frankly not the right approach, as Aaron articulated. So Greg, we've kept you pretty quiet up until now. So let's bring you into the conversation. Vensana made a pretty substantial investment in Artelon. Tell us a little bit about Vensana's vision, your investment philosophy, and so on.
Yeah, no, happy to. So do it through obviously the lens Artelon, but as I mentioned, pretty stage agnostic for us. We invest across the whole product life cycle, and so I think what we found attractive about Artelon, outside of just being a commercial stage company, was a platform technology. A technology that had potential for tendons and ligaments all over the body for augmentation. And while that's attractive, I think what was most attractive was the focus, is that the company knew exactly what it was going to do and what it wasn't going to do. And specifically, they were laser focused on the foot and ankle market and even more focused on lateral ankle instability. And so for us, the reason that was attractive is because they were picking an end market that was not only large, but where there was existing data, both from Artelon and from others, that suggests that patients get better outcomes when you augment lateral ankle instability. And so for us, it was sort of a play where we felt like you had a lot of options to control your own destiny. You could build a large market, in a single indication. You could expand broadly into foot and ankle. And then there was a bigger vision that if the fate determined it, which would be you could build a large standalone extremities and sports medicine business. And so we were really impressed by the focus, but also impressed, I think, by the optionality as well.
Awesome. So Aaron, raising money is a grind, right? It's probably the hardest and most significant job of CEO. Tell us about your experience. You obviously were quite successful starting early on and then ultimately to a large VC investment. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So when I came in 2017, the assets had been acquired by a group of what we'll call angel investors. They were, had pretty deep pockets. They were non-specialist investors. They had done some medtech investing before, but it wasn't their main area of focus. This is another area where our ability to focus on a market really helped, because raising money from angels involves a lot of very discrete discussions because they just don't understand your market, right? So the ability to tell a simple story about your company is really, really important there. Like a lot of small companies, we did a few rounds that were, kind of in the $3 to $5 million range, and it went well, but it is full contact. These are investors that like a lot of communication. When you're raising money in smaller amounts, you're raising money more often, right? So you're never really out of that fundraising cycle. You kind of move from one right to the next. And that works pretty well up to a certain size. So, in 2022, we had reached the commercial scale where we knew we needed to raise money in larger amounts. We could have kept going with our angel network, but it's all I would have been doing is raising money. So we knew he had to go out for institutional capital. Kind of circled a list of probably 40 VCs that we reached out to, pitched every one. From that 40, it became a list of maybe 15 where there was a good overlap between the characteristics of our company and their wheelhouse for investing. That ultimately whittled down to maybe 5 or 6 where there were substantial discussions, where we made it through multiple rounds of discussion. We knew there was a fit there. And ultimately there were 3 term sheets that came across, and Vensana, turned out to be the best partner for us. So
awesome. So maybe Greg, you could follow up on that. Tell us, a little bit about your diligence on Artelon. Not trying to get too confidential, but what boxes does a startup need to check in your mind to be considered?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, just as a commercial stage company, some of this will be specific to commercial stage assets. But everybody wants revenue. But I think once you have revenue, you're not selling the dream anymore. You have real metrics and data that people can start to point to, and so you can imagine, our biggest questions were on the commercial foundation. Has this company proven adoption? Have they gone deep or have they gone wide? Are they just getting utilization with KOLs? Are they actually starting to see adoption and uptake by, the broader universe of physicians? And those are important because it's really sort of a testament of have they proven the model, and with more capital, can they really scale the business? And I think we see all the time, not all revenue is good revenue. And so it's easy to kind of, take revenue when you can get it. But I think to take a really disciplined approach and say, hey, we're going to really drive deep in a single indication, that speaks to the ability to scale. And that's what the team had done there. maybe two of the more qualitative diligence points I'd highlight that I think are really important is for any asset that we look at, we're going to do our own diligence calls with physicians and KOLs in our network, as well as strategics. And if you're a CEO in the room, I just want to highlight how important those relationships are, because the single best thing a VC can hear when you make those calls is really interesting technology. We really like the team, and we've been really impressed with the progress over time. And so I'd give a compliment to Aaron, because those relationships take years to build, but they're really impactful when you start to make those calls. And the other thing I'd just highlight is we live in a really small ecosystem. Ironically, Adam and I got introduced through a mutual friend in 2023, and he was kind enough to share some perspectives on the foot and ankle market as we were getting up to speed. And so I think just the relationships in our ecosystem are really valuable, and it's just something to always keep in mind, is you never know who you're going to be talking to and who might be a diligence phone call for you.
Good question. Aaron, any interesting dynamics in your kind of negotiations with Vensana, or trying to actually get them to sign on the dotted line, write that check, that you'd point to?
Yeah, I think, the things you have to work the hardest for often turn out to be the best, right? And I think as we were going through multiple discussions with different potential investors, I would say Vensana was very discreet in their analysis of our business. And I would say Greg in particular, he's a data whiz. Yeah, he was able to take our commercial data and really dive down to understand the dynamics with customer retention and utilization, and where we were strong, where we were weak. I think from my team's perspective, that married pretty well with our whole management philosophy. We always felt like we were first and foremost a data company, that we were only as good as we could prove to outside entities. And it was even so far as a hiring philosophy with sales management, they had to be willing to manage by data and to go after attractive targets and be held to those types of metrics. So, it can be a pretty heavy lift to go that level of detail in a small growing company, but it really rewarded us pretty well, I think, because it was easy to communicate our value to multiple stakeholders, and the ones who understood us the best were Vensana. And ultimately that led to the partnership.
Fantastic. One of the questions that I get a lot is, what's Stryker's acquisition criteria? How much revenue, scale, growth rates, margin, et cetera. And so what I would say about that is we've looked at all of our deals for the last 10, 15 years, and we've benchmarked them all against each other in a variety of ways. And so we tend to bucket our deals into a couple of big buckets. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but we look at the metrics for that particular category. Obviously, our goal is to grow at the high end of medtech. We've been pretty public about that, so we look for high growth, but we also look for margin expansion. And so at the end of the day, we look at the financial metrics very carefully and very deliberately, but we also will do strategic deals, right? It's not just about the numbers. It's about the strategic fit, not only for the enterprise, but also for the particular business unit that's focused on that tech. So Aaron, maybe you could tell us a little bit more, in terms of the negotiations with Stryker, right? Big bad Stryker, you're a smaller company. What was that like for you? How would you characterize them?
Yeah, I would say, the deal-making process, every company and every deal is different, right? And I've been a part of a few of these, both on Adam's side of the table and on my side in this case, which was the sell side. It is hard work. And I think one of the key dynamics is you're in a small company that it's so critical that you continue to perform. But when you start getting into deal talks, it can become a major distraction, first and foremost for the CEO, but also for the people on your team that you're relying on to work through the deal. So I think through the process, our negotiations with Stryker were tough, but they were fair. I think both sides fought hard to get what they wanted. When you talk about competition around deals, I think a lot of people think of it like, we're going to get a banker and have 3 or 4 bidders. There's different ways to see competition around the deal. In our case, we had just raised money from Vensana. We were well funded out till 2027 and in theory out to profitability. So we weren't in a position where we had to do a deal or had to take a deal. Being revenue stage, we knew that our value was going to be tied to our revenue and our growth. So, if we would just continue to invest in our business and grow, then our value would grow in proportion to that. So, our negotiating strength was our ability to walk away unless we got a deal that really made sense for our investors. I think on Stryker's side, you guys had a really full pipeline of deals. And I think both sides saw the great strategic fit here. I think both sides believed that success was attainable. But we had to work very hard to get to that, that final deal.
No question. From my perspective, sitting across from Aaron and team, it was clear to me that there was a willingness to exit, but they didn't, quote, need to exit, right? They weren't desperate. And, having just raised that money, they were in a more powerful position, frankly, than a lot of the companies that I end up negotiating against. And you could tell that they had power at the negotiating table, and they leveraged it when they had to meet the goals and expectations that they had set. And I think as Aaron mentioned, in some sense, this was a very tough negotiation. We acknowledged it to each other throughout the process, but I think we also thought it was fun in some ways because we are all moving towards a common goal, and we all shared in the vision of what the collaboration or ultimate partnership between Stryker and Artelon could be. If we put these organizations together, we could really do great things. So that, seeing sort of the finish line at the end allowed us to stay focused throughout. There were some interesting issues that came up around deal structure, things like escrow versus reps and warranty, insurance-specific indemnities and whatnot. But at the end, I think we both, from my perspective, stayed fairly disciplined and knew what we wanted to accomplish, the levers we were able to pull, and ultimately came to a fair compromise that I think everybody left happy with, which for those that are kind of negotiation junkies like me, that's always the goal, right? Make it win-win. Greg, this kind of brings up an interesting point, I think, from your perspective as the investor, which is you had just put this money in not that long ago. And so it's sort of, do you take a quick exit? Do you wait for perhaps a longer return, a sure thing for what may be more risky? How did you view that from your perspective sitting there?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Adam. I think we tend to take pretty long time horizons when we think about an investment. We're planning to hold assets for 3 to 5 years, and we have a 10-year fund, and so I have the ability to be flexible as well. And so I think it really, speaks to kind of just aligning incentives. And I think as you think about just how we negotiated the financing, in a large part, what you're kind of trying to do is I think a good negotiation and a financing, kind of both parties are sort of learning together as you kind of test and assess your assumptions on, the probabilities of exit, the valuations at those exits, the capital requirements that might be required to get there. And it's really important, I think, to have those kind of scenario planning discussions up front, because ideally, you're kind of, you might not have perfect alignment, but you're sort of creating a worldview that you both kind of overlap quite a bit in, and you're ideally sort of structuring a deal that fits that mold. And so, I think because of the discussions we had about, what could an early exit look like, what could a later one, and kind of how we work to get to a deal that would work for everybody, it gave us the flexibility to enter into those discussions. I think all too often we do see, Adam, the thing we've talked about in the past, which is you have companies where you just raise a lot of money, you raise at a really high valuation, you need to grow into that valuation, right? And so I think it's really important to kind of have those disciplined, objective discussions up front and do your best to kind of align worldviews from the beginning. So
great. So one of the challenges I think that a lot of startups, founders, CEOs face is managing their board, right? Whether they're the VCs or angels that came in the beginning. Aaron, how'd you do that? What were the dynamics like? How hard was that for you?
Yeah, I think one thing you learn is that in the deal-making process, all of your prior sins come back to haunt you when you're trying to get alignment from your own stakeholders, right? And in some regard, we were pretty lucky because we had been very, very cash efficient and we had seen a lot of success. So when we started to really get serious about deal talks, we were in a position where all of our stakeholders were going to do pretty well, from first investors in to last investors in. I think along the way, some things that helped were when we were raising money in the angel years, we didn't get too far out of our skis on valuation. That's a number that angel investors can really get emotionally tied to. And when you're moving through those stages, it can be sort of a meaningless number. I hate to say it, but a lot of those guys are going to come in pro rata in each round, and their stake in the company may not go up or down very much. But you end up tied to this really high valuation that can preclude getting deals done with venture capital or eventually getting to an exit. So yeah, we fought that fight early on every time we raised money to really set a value for the company that we felt was fair and was not going to cause problems for us in the future. And it helped, our board was great. They were, even though some of them weren't from medtech or device, they had a lot of M&A experience. They had a great finance acumen. One of our board members was a venture capital guy that was a personal investor. So he was able to bring a lot of that perspective on how to value the company.
Yeah. And Greg, maybe you can give us your take, how involved do you get in these processes as you're sitting on a board, or does Vensana get, how are you viewing the activities? Do you trust the CEO? Do you leave it to them? Do you get really deep in? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I'd say ultimately we're looking for, a great teammate and a great partner. And, I think as a venture investor, you got to realize there's some things you can help with. There's a lot of things you can't help with. And so you're really, I think, putting a lot of trust and faith in your CEO. And because at the end of the day, strategic interest is great and that's the goal, but it's also an incredible distraction, right? And so it takes a lot of discipline from a CEO and a management team to kind of really assess that, both within their own lens, but also from the investor's lens. And I think Aaron did a great job in that. So.
Fair enough. So, Aaron, one thing I've always sort of wondered about, or, from your perspective, as a company like Artelon, right? You're on a really nice growth trajectory, but you need money, right, as you've alluded to. And I think sometimes you can take in a bunch of money where, in fact, you could actually price yourself out of a deal, right? Where your revenue doesn't match, the valuation expectations become super high, the multiples and all of that. So from a CEO's perspective, how do you think about that? How do you balance that need to continue to grow, yet at the same time not price yourself out, so to speak, or not put yourself in an adverse position relative to getting a deal done?
Yeah, I think part of it is strategy and part of it is timing. Just to beat my drum on focus again, when you really do one thing and you're trying to be a market leader at it, it's hard to fool yourself into thinking that you're doing better than you are. You really do have to have adoption and show that you're scaling the business in a meaningful way, which keeps you disciplined when it comes to deploying that capital. I think there's a phenomenon with orthopedic companies where if you look at precedent transactions, you see a lot of deals in the kind of $50 to $250 million range, and then very little from 250 up to about $1 billion. And then from $1 billion up, you start to see these larger scaled companies transact again. So when you have a growth strategy, it's important to know that crossing that chasm is very expensive, right? You're talking about moving from independent distribution to dedicated direct sales forces and things that become very capital efficient. And I think that's why a lot of deals get done in that range, because it's a strong motivator.
Right.
So,
no, great point. Greg, we're kind of running out of time here. Time really flies by. But Greg, maybe you can just give a last thought on, what do you suggest that founders do to ensure that they're set up for success, right? As they're starting to contemplate exit, obviously not the early stuff, but as you're getting to that point, what do you recommend? What do you tell the board or the CEO?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to assume your fate is going to be a standalone company, and you got to build a foundation that sort of sets you up to be that way. But I think at the flip side, how you do that and the sequence in which you do that is important. And so I think you got to, to your point on not getting over your skis, I think you got to concentrate your investments in kind of the highest ROI activities. That's going to be your product portfolio, your clinical evidence. With scale, I think you got to start to acknowledge that some of the things you might have to invest in, quality systems, manufacturing, a national sales force, you're replicating some of the things that strategics have. And so there's a diminishing return on some of those investments. And sometimes there's a great case to do that. But I just think that you have to be mindful about not overspending ahead of that infrastructure and kind of playing it out as it goes.
Awesome. So we've obviously covered a lot of ground here today. I think, look, raising money, getting an exit is hard. There's no question about it. And I think Aaron will tell you, as I've learned from him, that building that business took a lot of work, right? They needed a lot of money to execute the vision, but they had that vision. And clearly, relationships matter, right? Both with the investors that you're trying to get to fund your business, but also with the strategics. We built a relationship over several years to get to the point of ultimately executing the deal. Strategy, preparation are absolutely critical here. And from my perspective, I think Aaron was methodical in how he ran Artelon and how he built that business, much to his credit, bringing all his prior experience. And it was clear, right, both in the results, but also in the infrastructure that was built, which has frankly made our integration that much easier. And I think it's critical to bring that strategy and that preparation to the negotiating table, both with investors as you're trying to land that big VC investment, but also when you're at the table with strategics. And it's clear that Aaron and team did their homework as they entered the negotiating room with us, and they knew what was important to them, and so again, it made the discussions productive. Success requires vision. There's no doubt about that either, but you have to execute, right? You can't just have a vision and a strategy. You've got to deliver the results, and Artelon clearly did that. And of course, we need to execute on our vision in order to make this thing a success. So I know it can feel for a lot of the young companies in the room that like getting the investment and inking a deal is the hard part, but it's what you do after that, once you've got the money in the bank. And for us, once we've actually acquired the company, that matters. It's all about execution. And I think Aaron and Artelon is a great case study of that. And hopefully for Stryker will be the same. So thanks very much. Hope this was a great session. Appreciate you guys both being here.
Excellent, please.